Hi guys, this is chapter 3. Nope, sure isn't. It's chapter 8. Key issue 3. Sorry, it's a little delayed. I'm from a different location in my house right now. We had a 2-hour delay today, as you know. Now, this is what my surroundings look like. Fire, Christmas trees. Pretty good, I think. Anywho, you don't care about that. Let's get to the nitty-gritty. We're talking about boundaries for the most part in this one. And then if you have your nation-state organizer handy, then you can fill in those last 3 boxes that were on the back, the Rimland Theory, Heartland Theory, and Domino Theory. If you don't have them, because I'm pretty sure I do, then you guys can just write them down in your lecture notes for Key Issue 3. It doesn't really matter where you put them. You just need to make sure that you know them. Okay. There's a few things we're going to skip at the beginning here because we're going to do it in class. Okay. Nope. Okay. Okay. So, a couple more states you could add to your list on your nation-state organizer, which again I have, so you would have to just add it later. Is a landlocked state. So a landlocked state is a state that has no direct access to the sea. And that's typically not the geographical position you want your state to be in because water equals trade. So that means that if you are a landlocked state, then you have to have cooperation with neighbor states that might have access to the sea. So it's kind of one of those situations where you're having to rely on other states for resources, sort of like Haiti and the Dominican Republic that we looked at earlier today. Another type of state is a buffer state, and, oh, golly gee, I highlighted some of those for you in this map. So those are some buffer states, okay? So in Eastern Europe, between the USSR and the US allies, in Western Europe, there were buffer states. Mongolia, between China and Russia, is considered a buffer state. Nepal and Bhutan, between India and China, these two right here, are considered buffer states. And Jordan, between Saudi Arabia and Israel, is also considered a buffer state. So the point of a buffer state, I'm sorry it keeps doing that, is to prevent conflict between the two. So if you look at the bordering states, this tells you that there are issues between India and China, so they have a neutral party in between them that serves as a buffer state. So between China and Russia, don't get along with one another, so Mongolia, who is neutral to both parties, is in the middle, and that serves as a buffer state. Okay? Margie, what are you doing? Just digging at her bowl. Okay, so geopolitical theories, there's 3 you need to know. So these are the 3 that we had on your nation-state organizer that you haven't gone over yet. So, geopolitics, that term just means political issues that are influenced by geography. So the first one we're going to talk about is the Heartland Theory. Sometimes on the test it asks you about, instead of saying the Heartland Theory, it will say Mackinder Theory. So it's good if you know the guy that it's associated with as well. So Heartland, same thing as Mackinder, because Halford Mackinder developed the theory. So he argued that whoever controlled Eastern Europe, which was considered the heartland, it's in the center of the Eurasian continent, if you want to think about it that way, your heart is in the center of your body, would control the world because whoever controlled Eastern Europe would have easy access to Africa and Eurasia, which they also considered the world island. So those would be locations that had very valuable resources. Followers of the Heartland Theory include Hitler and the Nazis during World War II. That's why he went over the territories that he conquered, like Poland, Czechoslovakia. And this theory was proposed before the U.S. became a world and military power. That doesn't really happen for us until after World War II, because most of Europe was devastated, so we were kind of left as the most powerful country in the world, which of course the Soviet Union had a problem with. Okay, so this is kind of what it looks like. the heartland is also sometimes called the pivot area. So if you see that, just know that it's the same thing as the heartland. So whoever conquered this territory in orange had control of the world because of the resources that whoever was in control had access to. Hey, what are you chewing on? You're interrupting these kids' lesson. You're being very rude. Okay, the other one, and it's almost the opposite, is the rimland theory. And you should also know the guy associated with the rimland theory is Spyman. So he studies the heartland theory and argues that it's actually Eurasia's coastal areas that are the key to controlling the world and not the heart. So this is used in the Cold War by the Soviet Union. So it's exactly the opposite if you look at it. So in our first map, it was that center area. In this map, it is the coastal areas. And it's again about resources and also access to other countries, which is why the Soviet Union was very interested, because they were trying to spread their own political ideology. Okay, this other theory, the last one, is I think the easiest to remember. It's called the domino theory. It's popular during the Cold War. It's basically how the U.S. determines their foreign policy going forward in the Cold War. The belief was if you let a country fall to communism, that other countries surrounding it would fall to communism. So if you think about a dominoes, you knock one over, the rest kind of follow. That's why they called it the domino theory. And really, I mean, the Soviet Union thought the same thing. That's why they wanted the rimland. They wanted these coastal areas to bleed into other countries and other continents. So, domino theory, rimland theory, heartland theory. Heart is the center. Rimland is the rim of Eurasia. Domino theory, think of like the spread of something. Okay, and there's a little illustration for you. Okay, so more about boundaries. Boundaries are defined, demarcated, and administered, meaning boundaries are sometimes physical, but more often than not they are decided by some party or another, usually by whoever is in charge. And sometimes they are visibly marked and sometimes they aren't. Okay, so a boundary that you probably don't think about a lot is boundaries that exist out in the ocean. So oftentimes it seems like the ocean is so vast, like who actually claims any part of the ocean? And there actually is very specific legislation behind this. So the United Nations is the one who kind of mandates this law. It's called the Law of the Sea. So they decide in 1982 that the area that is 12 nautical miles from a state's shore is what is considered their territory. So 12 nautical miles out from your shore, that is your country's territory. And then from that, extending 200 nautical miles is the exclusive economic zone. So that means that, so from the coast of California, 12 miles out, that is considered U.S. territory. But we are allowed to engage in economic activity 200 miles beyond that. But that doesn't mean it's exclusive to us. We control that economically, but it's understood that other parties are going to come in order to do business, if that makes sense. Okay, so 12 and 200, those are the two numbers to remember. 12 is territorial waters, 200 is the exclusive economic zone. Okay. And then anything beyond that is called the high seas. Those are the open waters of ocean. And that's kind of where, not that laws don't exist, but the countries don't have control over those areas. Now you can use them, you can access them, but they don't belong to any one country. That's called the high seas. Okay, so here's another little chart to kind of help you. So again, the high seas is anything beyond that 200 miles, beyond the EEZZ, exclusive economic zone. Okay, however, there are some issues going on that regard the law of the sea currently, and that is happening in the South China Sea. So, keep these laws in mind as you watch the video. Basically, China is doing shady stuff in the South China Sea. So just watch this video, and he's going to tell you what they're doing.
This is the South China Sea. It's estimated nearly a third of the world's trade passes through this body of water. It is also at the heart of a very complicated 21st century territorial dispute. A half-dozen governments have competing claims over the South China Sea, including Vietnam, the Philippines, and Malaysia. But the biggest player here is clearly China, which has also embarked on the most aggressive campaign to claim.
So, because you might not be able to see it very well, hear it very well, let me just pause once in a while to go over it with you. No, go back to the
also embarked on the
Okay, so this is the South China Sea right here, and we have all of these other countries that share the sea. Obviously, you only have 12 nautical miles out, and then 200 miles for the exclusive economic zone, but Brunei, Malaysia, Vietnam, Philippines all share the sea.
Most aggressive
and China's not respecting those
to
rules.
claim its stake here. China's been building artificial islands in a region of reefs and partially submerged rocks known as the Spratly Islands, in some cases putting in brand new airstrips on locations like the recently constructed island of Fiery Cross. Here's what the island looked like before.
Okay, so this is super tricky. So what China is doing, because they want more territory in the South China Sea, and because of the United Nations law of the sea, stating that you only have 12 miles out, nautical miles out from your shore, they're building artificial islands in the middle of the South China Sea so that they can claim more territory of the sea. So these islands that he's showing you, they're all artificial. They were made by China and planted out there. Pretty tricky, right?
And here's what it looks like after this impressive land reclamation project. And Beijing has been issuing warnings to other ships and planes to stay away from these man-made islands. It doesn't take an expert to see that the Spratly Islands are much closer to the Philippines than they are to China. So how is China laying legal claim to this territory? Well, Beijing offers up maps dating back to the early 20th century, which have since become known as the 9-Dash map, a map that China has even begun printing in the pages of new Chinese passports. The Philippines disputes this, citing the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. It has taken China to the Permanent Court of Arbitration at The Hague, but China has so far refused to attend these hearings, arguing that the court has no jurisdiction in this matter. The U.S. is supporting its longtime ally.
Okay, so they kind of went back to these laws that we're not even sure are actually legitimate to state that they can claim this area. But I think the other thing to keep in mind that we're going to talk about a lot next semester is just the imbalance of geopolitics and how China is a very powerful country who has trading partners all over the world. The other countries that are in the South China Sea do not hold that power, so it's sort of like, what are they going to do about it? Not a lot. Okay, so just know that that's a conflict that's going on in the South China Sea right now. That tends to pop up on the test sometimes. Okay, and then we also have things like physical boundaries, like deserts, mountains, water. So physical, just like a physical map, shows features that are not man-made, that are naturally existing. Sometimes those things are used as boundaries as well. Cultural boundaries are religious boundaries and language boundaries, these two at the bottom. So the border between India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, that was all decided during the Indian Partition in 1947, which you guys are familiar with. And remember, the Hindus got India, the Muslims were forced to Pakistan, so that was divided between two religious groups. Language, lots of the different countries in Eastern Europe, like Czechoslovakia, and then what Yugoslavia broke up into, was decided, those boundaries were decided by the different languages spoken in that region. And then I have geometric up here on top. This is not an example of a geometric, of a cultural boundary. I just didn't want to make an extra slide. So a geometric boundary is the latitude and longitude, and determined by that. Okay, like the 38th parallel between North and South Korea was decided during the Cold War, and they just took that line of latitude to decide that. Okay, so this is something kind of different. We're kind of switching gears here. So now we're talking about the way that states are organized. So you guys know that state is the same thing as a country, not really like Nevada. U.S. would be considered a state, but not a nation state, because we have too many different ethnicities and cultures to call ourselves a nation state. So there's two ways to do this. You can divide your, and we're talking about governments here, so there's a federal government and then there's a unitary government. So federal splits power between a central government and local governments. I'm going to give you a nifty little organizer in class that's going to help you with this as well. This works really well in multinational states, like the U.S. We're not a nation state, but we are a multinational state. Checks and balances exist among branches to keep a balance of power. It works best with a really large state. So examples of this would be the U.S., Russia, Canada, and India all do a federal-like system. So if you think back to your Canadian quiz that you guys had a few months ago, you guys had to memorize all the different provinces. That's because that's a federal state. So there's Canada, and there's a Prime Minister of Canada, but then there's also smaller governments in Manitoba and Saskatchewan and all of those, okay? And then for a unitary government, whoop, that doesn't exist. It's just the government of the state. So power is held by some sort of central government. This works best in states that don't have a lot of cultural differences. And it works in compact states, and we're going to talk about state shapes in a little bit in class. But smaller states that are very homogeneous works best with unitary states. So France, small, pretty homogeneous, although lately not as much. And France has kind of been pushing back against that. The UK, South Africa, China. Now, China is not a small state by any means, but they are a very homogeneous people. Okay? All right. So, you guys know what a capital is. I'm not going to explain that to you, the capital of a country. But a forward thrust capital is a capital that is placed in a less populated area to draw migrants and development to that area. Or sometimes a capital will be too far on the outskirts of a state, so they'll move it to be more center. So like Brasilia in Brazil, that moved from Rio to the current location, Brasilia. And then there was one on Jeopardy the other night, babe. Do you remember what that was? Nigeria?
What was it?
When they moved the capital. That's my husband, you guys.
Congo?
It was Nigeria. It went from Lagos to... someone's gonna look that up, and if you look it up, I'll give you extra credit. So Nigeria had a capital in Lagos, and they moved it. I can't remember. It was a Jeopardy question the other night, you guys. This class comes up on Jeopardy all the time. Okay, but basically a forward thrust capital is when you move the location of the capital for some reason. Okay, local governing bodies exist in these different entities: city governments, school districts, police jurisdictions. Okay, and oh, we're done. Okay, great. So I expect to see some pretty lengthy notes for this lecture. I was grading your Kyushu 1s, and some of us did not take very good notes, and that is where your pop quizzes are going to come from. So just be on your toes. Sorry, this one was a little long. Okay, see you next time.